Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is geared up for Regional Scrum Gathering Kolkata Day 2. It's an honor and privilege to host Professor Dave Snowden today, well-known researcher in the field of knowledge management and the application of complexity science, known for the development of Scientific framework. Dave is the founder and chief scientific officer of Cognitive Age, and today he'll be talking about Rewilding Agile. He's here with us. And without taking much time, I'll move over to Dave. Dave, over to you. We are live.
Okay, so I'm trying to work out how to share slides. If you could tell me how I do that.
Yeah, in the bottom line, third button from the left, you can share screen. Yep.
Getting that. Right, so hopefully you can see a slide now.
Yep. All good.
Okay, so firstly, apologies for not being with you, but force of circumstances and all that. It's weird for me. I normally spend about 250 days in hotels every year, and the cats don't even know me when I come home. But I now actually haven't traveled for well over a year, so it's a weird, use a British phrase, a discombobulation. Yeah. What I want to do today is to talk around this theme of rewilding, which is an ecological concept of restoring the balance in nature, but also of avoiding excessive structure. So if we come into something that Jeff was saying when I first came in, there's a sort of minimum necessary bureaucracy, but that will change with context. And part of my argument is most of the current method groups, and I don't think they're frameworks, are actually overstructured, and I'll describe why in a minute. I'm then going to go on and talk about some fairly pragmatic techniques in what we call pre-Scrum techniques, things you do before you even get into a Scrum. And then I'm going to finish off with some of the stuff we're currently doing on the wider field around COVID. Next week, I've actually spent the last 9 months writing a field book on how to manage in crisis and complexity. And that's going to be published by the European Union next week. So there's a whole body of stuff going on around that. So I'll talk briefly about that at the end because I think it's relevant to people. And if I've got time, I'll talk a bit about the work we're doing on mental health, because one of the things we're going to face over 2021 is a mental health crisis, which will be equivalent to the COVID crisis. And we're going to see that both in remote and non-remote working. So I'll just open up some of that at the end in case anybody's interested. Now, the overall context on this work is complex adaptive systems theory. And I'm not going to go into the Cynefin framework in detail, nor am I going to go into complexity in detail. I want to just highlight a couple of things that you should bear in mind. One of the basic metaphors for complexity, and this comes from Alicia Geraro, Kurtz and I used it in a paper like bramble bushes in a thicket, is this phrase like bramble bushes in a thicket. Right? Now, if you want a more regional variation of that, you could talk about a mangrove swamp. So everything is entangled with everything else. And there's a bigger phrase on this on the Cynefin book, which came out in December. John Seeley Brown, wonderfully on the cover, said we're moving from enlightenment to entanglement. So we're moving from this concept of rational design and engineering approaches into a recognition that all sorts of things are entangled in complex ways, in ways that we don't understand. And the metaphors of engineering and the metaphors of machines, although they have high utility, do not actually work in terms of high levels of human interaction. So complexity, some key lessons on this. Complexity is about understanding the entanglement. That means that, for example, one of the things we focus on is how do we generate informal networks? Because informal networks entangle the formal organization to allow efficient communication and efficient flow of ideas. Not everything has to be formal. And again, that comes from complexity theory. The other thing we know is that how people interact matters more than any qualities they bring to the equation. And I'll come back to this towards the end. You can't engineer an agile culture, let alone a mindset, but you can change the way that people interact so that different types of culture will emerge. And I'll talk practically about how you both map that and how you intervene towards the end. But if you can hold this fundamental metaphor that we're living in a world which is deeply entangled. And if you ever go into a thicket, all right, this is a small woodland in the UK, and I do this because I go hiking. You know that there are separate plants there, but you don't know, you can't really see what's separate. And if you take something, you have unintended consequences. And that's the other big thing you need to understand about a complex adaptive system is any intervention, the only thing you can say with certainty is that you will produce unintended consequences, and you have to be ready for those, and you have to take responsibility for them. So complex adaptive systems are defined by entanglement. Everything is entangled with everything else. They're managed by managing how things interact, not by trying to manage the things themselves. And finally, this awareness of unintended consequences is key. Now, if I come to Agile, let's look at the concept of rewilding. This is common in ecosystems now. And the principle is that you restore something closer to how it would exist in nature, so you don't overexploit it. This is actually quite important in the context of COVID, by the way, that we know that and COVID isn't the worst plague I'm going to see in my lifetime, and I'm just coming up to 67. Because we're stressing the environment and stressing the animal population so much that we're going to get far more significant animal to human disease vectors. And so the whole rewilding movement is about trying to restore a balance into nature and avoid overstructure, over-exploitation, over-engineering. Now, to illustrate that, this is a picture of a timber wolf. If you look at canines in the wild, you've got wolves, you've got jackals, you've got wild dogs, you've got a series of species, but they're fairly limited in number, and they have a common appearance and common look, and they're actually quite resilient. But when man gets involved in this and starts to domesticate any creature, within 7 generations, you get a huge variation in species. And actually, none of these are particularly resilient, and a couple of them are really ugly if you look at it. My argument at the moment is Agile has tended to go down this route. The various Agile tribes have become over-specialized, over-functionalized, constantly trying to differentiate themselves from others, and we've lost some of that essential wildness, that's adaptive or resilience capacity. So that's kind of like the theme of the talk. And in some ways now, an Agile implementation in a large organization actually isn't about Agile, it's just about a different type of bureaucracy. There's a rule in Sensemaking, which is my field, is if you can't draw a framework on the back of a table napkin from memory, it lacks all utility. Scrum kind of like passes that test, SAFe doesn't. So part of the principle here is to leave a space for things which are different, and a space for novelty rather than excessive bureaucracy, excessive structure, and trying to create everything as some massive engineering diagram. Yeah? I've said many times, I think the SAFe framework looks like a design drawings for a chemical plant, yeah, rather than a mapping of how to produce good software. So there are several things that are problems here, and let's give you 3 more biological metaphors before I get on to that. You need to create space for wildflower gardens. That's where you get genetic variety. You can't eliminate that variety. You need to leave a lot of space for people to do things which break the rules and create novelty. It can't be more than a small percentage, but without that, you have a problem. Formal gardens are very beautiful, but they take a huge amount of energy and maintenance. So the wild garden doesn't take much. The formal garden takes a huge amount of costs. Again, that comes back to this issue about managing informal as well as formal systems. You get a lot more benefit for a lot less energy if you link and connect people informally than if you try and formalize the way that they interact or how you expect them to behave. And then there's kind of like the sort of complex approach where I'm sort of using paddy fields as an example, where you build constraints, but you allow a lot of variety within the constraint structure. So you know where the boundaries of something are, but then within the boundaries, you allow different crops and different plants to be planted. So hold some of those concepts and let's look at Agile itself. Now, continuing the keynote metaphor, I think a lot of Agile implementations actually aren't Agile. I'm using the metaphor here, they're a sheep in wolf's clothing. So they're pretending to be this wild, ferocious, wonderful thing. But in reality, they're just a variation of what's gone on for the past 30 or 40 years. And we can see a series of issues here, and I'll go through these quickly. One is there's a huge paradox in the nature of structure. If you go back to the founding of the Agile Manifesto, which is just coming up to 20 years. My Cynefin framework was 21 years old in December, so they paralleled for a bit, then they came together. The driver, if you look at the manifesto, is really XP rather than Scrum. Scrum pre-existed the manifesto. And there's some elements of DSDM in there as well. But it doesn't really scale. If the manifesto meeting in Snowden had just been XP people, Kent and people like that, we probably never have heard about it except within esoteric journals. What allows something to scale is when people structure it, and that's what Scrum provided, which is why Agile became coterminous with Scrum for a long period. This is Max Guasso's work, if you know it in knowledge management, is in order for something to diffuse broadly, it has to move to a high level of abstraction and a high level of codification, because then it can be picked up by diverse populations, not by people who have deep training or experience. So you get this paradox. If you want something to scale and to spread very quickly, you have to structure it. But if you structure it too much, then you lose the energy or drive which is a part of it. And it's that balance which is difficult. And I think Agile benefited hugely from scaling around Scrum. But it's not going to benefit if it continues just to be Scrum and if it doesn't introduce more diversity. But I'll say up front, I think Scrum is one of the most valuable methods ever produced within software development. But it's not a universal. It's a way of transiting in Cynefin terms from complex to complicated. The second problem, and this is a general problem, you can see this in design thinking now, is what I call a certification scam. I've got 3 sets of letters after my name. They all came from 4 or 5 years of study in respectable academic institutions. They didn't come from turning up for a 3-day course and filling out a multi-choice questionnaire based on an open book exam. And I think there's a real problem in Agile at the moment in that people collect certifications, and the certifications basically claim they have competence to do something, even though they may have no actual experience. And there's a whole body of work where you can know the theory, but if you don't know the practice, it's key. And the net result of that is we're producing a lot of recipe book users and very few chefs, and that's a key metaphor. So a recipe book user follows a formula. And if everything is in the right place, they have the right ingredients, the right equipment, they can produce a competent meal. But if anything goes wrong, they're lost. Whereas the chef has theoretical knowledge of taste and practical wisdom acquired through an apprenticeship. So they can produce a wonderful meal with whatever happens to be lying around in your kitchen. And Agile has driven itself down this recipe book approach and has forgotten the need for chefs, which is kind of like that point there. The other point is trying to follow somebody else's journey. If I hear anybody else saying they're adopting the Spotify model, I think I'm going to quietly tear out my few remaining hairs. I mean, Spotify themselves say there isn't a model to follow. There's the current stage of the journey that they took. And that journey itself is critical to what works within Spotify. You can't take the output or the end point of something and say, I want there. You can recreate the starting point, so you create your own journey. And that's a severe problem. It's, oh, I like that. Can I do it? Well, yeah, you can do it, but you've got to live through the previous 10 years that they lived through and create something contextually appropriate. We then get the myth of empiricism, and the word empirical is used really badly in the Agile community. It actually doesn't mean an evidence-based approach with multiple people involved in parallel tests. It means what worked for me last time. And there's a whole body of methods and tools within Agile, and I wouldn't include Scrum in this, but I would include some others, which are basically, well, this worked for me last time, so I've codified it and created a certification course. This is problematic enough in stable times, but in unstable times, it's really very dangerous, because what worked for the past 10 or 15 years isn't going to work for the next 4 or 5. because the whole world is going through a massive change and we're going to need a different approach. So there's a huge value in what I recall of what happened in the past, but it's not reliable. And if you look at the evidence on this from natural science, if you give the famous case on this, you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. On average, 83% of radiologists won't see it, even though their eyes scanned it. So your recollection of what worked or didn't work for you is deeply biased anyway. And actually, systems analysts have a problem because they're only going to see what they expect to see. Our past sort of frames the way we see the present, and say there are evolutionary reasons for that. You then get the confusion of correlation with causation. In even more detailed case-based work, somebody will go and study 10 or 15 companies who have a quality that everybody desires. They'll identify things that those companies have in common, and then they'll say, well, if you do these things, you too will be successful. Now, say in real science, that's caused a confusion of correlation with causation. The vast majority of American Fortune 500 companies have CEOs who play golf, but it doesn't imply that golf lessons are a substitute for management education. And the one I love, if any country wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, all it has to do is increase dark chocolate consumption, because dark chocolate consumption per head of population exactly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the past 4 or 5 decades. So that's actually got more data than exists behind most of the methods. And you see this in a lot of the popular books. I mean, Good to Great, rather embarrassingly, all the companies he mentions have now failed in various ways, is a good example of trying to create a recipe book based on a false correlation in terms of understanding. This is a big problem wider for society. Yeah. And finally, what I call ideology-based evidence. This is where somebody has a theory and they go and find aspects of cases which support that theory. If I'm being brutal about this, I would say about 80% of the popular Agile books that I've read do precisely that. Somebody's got something which they know people will like to hear, which goes with a certification course or a consultancy offering, and they just go and use the internet or some books to find examples and aspects of those examples which will support their theory. They don't do any rigorous investigation of that. One of the worst examples of this is Lacroix's Reinventing the Organization, which is very dubious in terms of its evidence base. I mean, it's got some wonderful ideology in it. It's a religious textbook, but the evidence to support it is actually very weak. Now, these are issues not just in Agile, they're issues in the adoption of novelty, and we've known about this sort of stuff for years. I've written a lot of work on this on apex predator theory, sometimes known as flexuous curves, which you can look up on the website. That when something is completely new, the way it stabilizes the environment is key. If it starts off in the wrong direction, it carries on. And I think that's why a lot of people are talking about resetting Agile. But the minute you say anybody talking about, anything with 2.0 or 3.0 or Agile 2, kind of like they're probably a good thing to avoid. It's an attempt to reinvent something and claim I've now got the new truth rather than to build on what's actually worked in the past. So let's look at Sensemaking. And again, I'm sort of switching my metaphors now. The Tower of Babel is an old legend in which man, becomes too arrogant and thinks he'll build a tower to get to God. And so God basically gives man multiple languages or multiple cultures so that we fall apart and we can no longer challenge God. Again, that's kind of like a metaphor, in terms of Babel or Babel or whatever. Yeah. So naturalizing sense-making works on 2 principles. First of all, in a world of change, empiricism and cases, this is an inductive approach, have limited utility. If you look at it in terms of logic, there are 3 types of logic: deduction, induction, abduction. So deduction, if A, then B. Induction, all the cases of A have B. That's the case-based approach. Abduction, which is where I work, is what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things. Now, a lot of my original work was in counterterrorism, working on a major DARPA program, Genoa 2, which was headed by Admiral John Poindexter and others. And we were looking there effectively at, if you look at what happens in counterterrorism, is somebody always spots what the terrorists were beforehand, but nobody pays attention to it. And the reason is, it's called joining up the dots. And if you know the mathematics of dots, if I have 4 dots, there are 6 connections, which means there are 64 basic patterns. But if I go up to 10 dots, I'm getting well over 3.5 trillion possible patterns. So with the benefit of hindsight, we can all see the causal pattern, but hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. So one of the big problems that I started working on 20 years ago is, how do I create an objective measure of abduction, of intuitive insight? And I haven't got time to go into that now, but you'll see one of the sort of pictures we use on this. And this is key in a world of uncertainty, because you have to find the 17% who've seen a gorilla who are ignored by the 83%. And that's been a large part of my work. And that's actually quite important in something I'm going to come to in a minute, which is identifying unarticulated user needs to feed into a Scrum backlog, rather than actually working entirely with identified needs. Yeah, because if you really want to innovate, you've got to use existing technology to satisfy unarticulated needs. That's actually what Apple do very well. It's not just the things that people know what to ask for. And another reason why that's important is technology is advancing far too quickly for users to be able to ask what it's capable of doing anyway. So we've got to start to rethink that. So the way naturalizing sensemaking works is to take natural science as a constraint. We know there are things about systems. So we know if the system has a certain level of interaction, that you can't manage the things, you can only manage the connections. We know that only 17% will see gorillas, so we need to build systems on the assumption we've got to find those 17%, and so on. And that's been my work now for about 3 decades, is to use natural science in social systems rather than using case-based approaches. And so that means we develop methods and tools which are linked in with natural science, which has been subject to third-party verification, to repeated experiments, and so on. So let's go through some methods and tools around this. And I'm using a phrase here from Lincoln: as the times are anew, so we shall think anew and act anew. So I'm going to go through some examples on this. I'm now going from theory to practice. Let's look at some pre-Scrum techniques. And these are kind of like things we're currently formalizing. For people who read my blog, I announced a couple of days ago that we're moving all of our methods into an open source wiki. So we're not putting them behind a firewall. And that's actually quite important if you want to develop a field. We're not trying to scale by proprietary control and by certification. We're actually scaling by producing artifacts to go with open source methods. So these are going to be in the wiki. You can copy them, you can use them. All you have to do is attribute them. That's the most important thing. So the first is the use of trios. Now this is both a simple technique and a more sophisticated technique. One of the problems you've got within IT development in general is finding out what users really need rather than what their representatives say they want. And I've been in IT all my life in various forms, and I've also been in application software development for a large part of that, where you're developing software in order to meet needs that people don't know they've got. But when they're able to do something about it, they'll suddenly realize the importance. And so that's kind of like a different way of thinking. So the way trios work is we actually take 3 people from a diverse background. The one we're using a lot in Agile at the moment is to take a young coder, somebody, fairly new out of college, really fast fingers on the keyboard, can prototype quickly, can show things, together with somebody else who's much more experienced, a systems architect or a systems tester. People who test whole systems often have a better perspective on the whole than many others. And then the third component is a user trained to talk to IT people. And I can go into this later if anybody wants, but it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. So that's a trio. And so we give a trio a task and say, over the next 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever you want, Yeah, just talk and go and meet people and use your networks and chat and come up with some ideas about things we could do to make a difference. But we don't just have one trio, we have 10, we have 15, we have 20 trios. And then we look at what comes out of those diverse, parallel, safe-to-fail experiments. Canadian people will recognize that. Safe-to-fail experiments, but in large parallel numbers. And from that, we basically then can start to identify user demand, and we will have found some of the 17%. We'll have found some of the things that systems analysts or user executives could not told us about. So that's one technique. Second technique, I originally developed this when we founded DSDM. I was one of the 3 founders of that in the UK ages ago. We met at a pub in Cheltenham for an evening meal. We were British, so that's what we did rather than a ski resort. And it was actually 3 competitors who came together. Yeah, because we said if we actually work together to create a standard and a method, we can get adoption. Yeah, and one of the big things in DSDM is the use of rapid application design and joint application development, RAD-JAD. Originally, interestingly, invented by IBM in Canada, but not taken up. Now, I think this is one of the neglected techniques in Agile, but the way we use the enforced mutation is we'll have an 8-hour design session in which we'll bring users together with systems architects together with prototypers. And over the 8 hours, we'll use the prototypers to literally build physical prototypes of what the system will look like, semi-working, semi-robust prototypes. And then at the end of 8 hours, and we first did this in Farnborough, we then passed on the prototype to a team in Mumbai, and basically said, we're not going to tell you what the original requirement was for the workshop, but here's what we produced. Do whatever you want to improve it. You've got 8 hours. At the end of the 8 hours, they handed it on to another team in San Jose in California with the same instruction. And then we got back together in Farnborough, which is just to the southwest of London, for those who don't know it. And we looked at the result. And it wasn't what we designed. It was different, but it was more valuable. And every time I've run that technique, the users have said, God, I would never have thought of that. Could I please have it? So what we're doing is to create a highly time-compressed mutation method to generate better or more resilient requirements. And of course, because they've got this visualization in the prototype, that's more valuable. And articulated need mapping is a whole field in its own right. But it's where, for example, we use continuous journaling or mass capture of the fragmented narratives of people's day-to-day existence. And then we look at clusters within that, clusters of frustrated stories, which are indexed or interpreted in similar ways. And then sit down with technology people and say, could you do something about this? Could you improve this situation? So we're trying to move technology and Agile here from reactive response, i.e. faster development of what users have said they wanted, into a much more co-evolutionary interaction between the users at a more fundamental level before that articulation. And again, that produces a more resilient system design. And then the sort of corollary of this, and this is from 2 years' work we did on a complex systems approach to design thinking, is you have distributed ideation where you present the problems literally to 2,000 or 3,000 people. And within a couple of hours, you get clusters of ideas back, and then the clusters become requirements. Yeah? Now, you'll notice all of these things are designed to handle inherent uncertainty. Scrum is a brilliant technique because it takes things which are more or less settled, but you go through iterations till you get them right. This is that pre-Scrum area where you need to actually have a much more open and exploratory environment. And that leads into this big new field, which is called exaptive development, where you start to repurpose existing technologies for novel needs. And in a crisis, that's kind of like a key development. So I've given you 5 techniques there. All of those are getting documented on the wiki. All of them are a mixture of theory and practice. But they're also leading into this concept that no one method or no one tool can cover everything. It's why I actually think Scrum is not a framework. It's a collection of methods, and actually that's its value. The other big thing we've worked on is the idea of scaffolding. And scaffolding isn't just the sort of steel structures, or if you're in Hong Kong, the bamboo structures. Scaffolding can be internal or external. If you think about it, an insect, it has an exoskeleton. If you think about mammals, they have an endoskeleton. So an exoskeleton means the external boundaries are defined. So you don't get much variety. With mammals, you get the internal skeletons, you get a huge amount of variety, but with a sort of core coherence to the system, and that can scale better. So what we're now starting to do in systems architecture is effectively to determine the scaffolding type that we need. And that might, for example, actually be an informal network. I've written a series of blog posts recently on this using microconzia, which are the roots of fungi, which connect the roots of trees. And they extend 500 times as far as the roots of the trees. They effectively entangle them in a symbiotic relationship. So the fungi roots are like the informal network, the trees are like the formal system. But what we're trying to do here is to move to a point where you define a scaffolding and you define the interaction of software and people. This is kind of like a reworking of object orientation. You have polymorphism, inheritance, defined input-output, by which you actually define the interactions with the scaffolding and with each other, and you allow applications to emerge as a result of that interaction. So design now starts to become an emergent process. You may not actually have a specific goal, and then within that you may use other techniques. And then I think one of the things we're arguing very strongly is you should bring back some of the old ideas. So there's a place for waterfall. If you know exactly what you have to do, and you know what resources you have to use within a limited, within a certain degree, then you might as well use a structured technique. There's nothing wrong with it. And I remember working with Telstra in Australia, and they have a lot of waterfall projects, but nobody got promoted for doing waterfall, so they decided to create one-year sprints so they could say they were being agile. And that sort of absurdity is very common in large organizations. And I've talked about time boxing. This to me is one of the big neglected aspects of Agile. In a time box, you guarantee to the user a delivery date, but you actually have a range of resources and a range of deliveries, and you either vary the delivery or you vary the resources, but you always guarantee that a minimal product will be delivered on that date. And again, that's something which has high value because you can have 2-month or 3-month time boxing. Now, there are some other methods which got swept aside in the Agile search, which actually would help Agile. So those were 2 examples of that. And then kind of like, as I start to conclude on this, we need to stop talking about mindset and we need to stop talking about culture in the sense of this is what a culture is. I mean, if you know anything about anthropology or anything about complexity, you would never, ever try and define a culture in advance. Cultures are emergent properties of multiple small interactions over time, and they're represented in micro-narratives. They're not represented in mission statements and goals, or God help us, purpose statements, which is one of the latest fads. Yeah. This is a gaping void cartoon I like a lot. You actually don't stand a chance. This is a tidal wave. Yeah? If you're mobile, if you're agile, ironically, you can ride a wave, but you can't control it. So this is actually an example of a culture map. What we've done here is we've done a mass capture of people's day-to-day stories, the stories of the water cooler, the stories of the beers after work, which is actually where the reality of culture is represented. And then we've drawn from that a map based on the way that people interpreted their own micro-narratives. And each of those colored areas represents actually a tribe or a clan or a cultural group. And you can see immediately that there's overlap and there's differences. Yeah? And if we want to migrate this, we don't start by saying where we want it to be. We start by saying where it is, and then we nudge it. This is called vector theory of change. So if, for example, I want to get rid of the blue stuff at the bottom and move it more towards the purple stuff, I click on the purple stuff and look at the stories and say to people, I need more stories like these. Then I click on the blue one and fewer stories like those. Now, we've done a lot of this within the health service. If you say, how do we get a better attitude towards patient safety, people get defensive. If you say we need more patient stories like these and fewer patient stories like those, you get higher engagement. We actually do this for Agile teams to actually understand the user stories that user stories tell about Agile teams, so that in your retrospective, you can say, well, we need more of these and fewer of those, rather than talking in these idealized qualities. Complexity is about starting journeys with a sense of direction, not about trying to achieve predefined goals. And this is kind of like deeply pragmatic, more like this, fewer like that, everybody can engage in. The flip charts with wonderful platitudes and rah-rah sessions, anybody with any sense gets turned off quite quickly. Final point on Agile before I just raise a couple of things at the end. This is a key principle of complexity science. You don't scale a complex system by aggregation or imitation. You scale it by decomposition and recombination. This is actually why the first time I ever saw the SAFe diagram, I said it was wrong a priori. It wasn't that I hadn't done the training, I hadn't got the experience, but that's not how you scale a complex system. If you think about it, the whole of organic life form comes from the recombination of 4 basic chemicals. So if you want to scale a complex system, you decompose and recombine. And there's some interesting work we and others are working on at the moment, for example, which is to decompose Scrum and say, well, actually, you've got here a retrospective, or here you've got a sprint. What happens if we recombine those lowest units with things like a time box? And I think this is where Agile has got to start to go. It's not just using the methods as defined, but it's deconstructing the methods and recombining them across proprietary boundaries. So we get a much more fluid system, which will scale because it's got the adaptive capacity of the wolf, rather than the over-refined sort of thing of the toy dogs and things like that. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my time here. I just wanted to flag 2 things up for anybody who's interested. If you're interested in this, look on the blog. This is the flowchart from the European field book on how to manage complexity in a crisis. As you can see, it has 4 basic stages: assess, adapt, accept, and transcend. And then within that, a series of structured processes. Now, we are going to be, that book is for free. Anybody will be able to download it next week. I'll put the links up. But we're also starting to create training courses around this and familiarization courses. And we're particularly interested in consultancy groups who want to be able to pick up the associated methods and then roll them out in companies. So if anybody's interested in that, get in touch. And linked with that is a major bunch of work we're starting to do, which is to look at mental health within organizations. And that we're using the concept of entangled trios. So by increasing the density of people's peer-to-peer interaction, you increase the resilience of system and its ability to cope. And again, that's going to be part of the sort of COVID set of things we're going to be offering into our network shortly. So that's coming to the end of what I wanted to say. I've got to try and find a way of stopping the sharing. Yeah, okay. Basically, what I've been trying to argue is not that anything we're doing is wrong, but it's right within boundaries, and we need more diversity. It's not about Scrum, it's not about SAFe, it's not about Kanban, it's not about this, it's not about that. It's about decomposition and recombination. And it's also about changing the way we interact with users so that we can map those unarticulated needs and move things forward more quickly. Thank you very much for your time.